Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Esteemed panelists, distinguished guests. It is my pleasure to moderate this evening session and the launch of a provocative ballad, The Radical Imagination of F N Souza. On a personal note, it's a very special evening for me because the first project I ever managed when I moved back to India for AVID was the launch of Tata Literature Live in 2010. And we have had a long collaboration under the guidance of Anil Dharkar, who we all miss, and under the stewardship of Amy and Kwasar, this collaboration has continued and will continue. So congratulations to the entire Literature Live team for reaching this 15-year milestone. To the task at hand now. Souza's art is often controversial, bold distortions of human form and stark critique of religion, poverty, and sexuality. And as critic John Berger once said, how much of Souza's pictures dwell from Western art and how much from the heriatric temple traditions of his country, I cannot say. Because he straddles several traditions, but serves none. And therein lies the brilliance of Souza, his refusal to be boxed in any one category, instead creating a genre of his own. Born in Goa in 1924, Souza's life was a tale of disruption and boundary-pushing creativity. He was a pioneer and co-founder of the Bombay Progressive Arts Group and one of the independent India's first artists to gain international recognition. Last month, during the Festa de Goa at the Royal Opera House, we curated a session which was a tribute to the modern master, the boy from Crawford Market. So this evening's panel feels like a natural extension of that conversation. As we celebrate Souza, we're reminded of his pioneering vision and radical ways in which he redefined the boundaries of modern art. And to delve deeper into this provocative palette, we are joined by two experts, each bringing a unique perspective to the life of Souza. Janeita, congratulations on the book. It's a culmination of 12 years of research, deeply personal, very scholarly journey. Now, you told me you didn't bring my book to read from it, but I've quoted here. In the preface you write, the question that drove me in the beginning were, why is Souza's art uneasy to the eye? And what triggers and provokes when we look at Souza's art and why? Please share what drew you to Souza as a subject and what led you to embark on such an extensive journey.
All right, so first of all, why Souza? That is because Souza is an exercise in shadow work of the human collective consciousness.
Just give me the volume up a little bit.
Or maybe like this is not on or something. Could you just pull it? Or you give me a mic?
Yeah, you use mine to the time.
All right. So why Souza? Because Souza's body of work is an exercise in shadow work of the human collective consciousness. So in 2011 to 13, I was undergoing a personal crisis. I was in a very chaotic phase and much into readings of art, classical literature, great playwrights. There's also religious scriptures. And in that context, I came across Souza's body of work again. I'd seen his work many times before, but at that time, I kind of, regarded him as part of a group, the PAG artists. But now, in context of the self-healing journey, when I looked at his art, I began perceiving new insights into it. And I would also say that this came about because by that time, I'd been embedded in Carl Jung's psychology for more than a decade. And I began seeing shadows and archetypes dancing on Souza's canvases. Also when I would, visit art collectors' homes, it was that, they would just bring a suitcase from their loft and kind of open it, and they would unwrap a Souza and show me. So that really fired my brain cells, and I thought, and they said that, we buy a Souza for the asset value, but then we can't hang it in our living rooms. So these were the questions which drove me in the beginning. Why is Souza's art uneasy to the eye? And what provokes and triggers us when we look at his art, and why? And I would say that I came to believe that, when people in a particular epoch or times It's that they connect to an energy of that time. So maybe Souza and Carl Jung never met each other, but they were connecting to the energy of that time. And they were working towards that, staying at different places and in their own spheres. Yeah? And so it became challenging for me, as well as exciting, to do a critical study on Souza, his life and art, which became so much a part of my self-healing journey. So I would say my connect was visceral, thought-provoking, as well as cathartic. So these questions became my driving force, the uneasy space, and the more I embraced it, the more secrets were revealed to me about the body-mind-spirit connection, the collective conscious, unconscious, as well as the cultural baggage attached to it. So the stronger the shadow, the more. Like if you look at something and you get triggered and there's a strong reaction, the shadow is colossal and dark, and we need to do something about it.
Thank you, and hence the title you chose. And the title?
Yeah, so then the archetypal artist, like so according to Carl Jung's psychology, it's like people, artists and certain genius, creative people, they have this automated creative complex in their psyche, and it drives them. So Souza was a compulsive artist. Like there's this anecdote about him that he arrived in London with 15 pounds and he spent 10 pounds on his art, and he had just 5 pounds for lodging and food. So he was a compulsive artist, and like Carl Jung said, being acted upon by alienated forces, which pushed him, like drove him like a marionette. And yeah, so if when a society, it could be like an individual consciousness, when we go too much towards one polarity, the unconscious erupts and things happen and they pan out. So if the society is like just going one way, then it's creatives through the unconscious that they're able to tap into primordial imagery or into certain things in the unconscious, which then play out through their work.
We're going to come back to many of these in the questions I have for you. I'm going to go back to Kamini, actually start with Kamini. Kamini, this year marks the centenary of 5 visionary artists. I know you're going to be speaking about them tomorrow, but today we have you first. Ram Kumar, K.G. Subramaniam, F N Souza, Gaitonde and Mohan Samant, all of whom brought a unique forward-thinking perspective to Indian art, with Souza and Gaitonde having the Bombay-Goa connection. Now, I was going to read your extensive bio here, being the first Indian board member of the International Committee of Museums and Collections of Modern Art. You engage with global standards of best practices in museums. Now, how is Indian art and artists perceived today globally in the museum space? And specifically, how do you think Souza's work resonates in the contemporary art institutions of today?
Okay. So, post-independence, at least some of our artists went abroad in the hope of establishing an international presence for modernism and also to build their careers. So you had Souza, Raza, Bakre, Akbar Padamsi and Gaitonde. Some of them came back, some of them tried to stay on. But the sad part was, I think, really, for the most part, the largest impact they had was in their own countries. Because if you look at who was buying, and their art, it was mainly people in India, or it was NRIs. And even for the most part of it, Indian art was not taken seriously in the West by both museums and collectors, because Indian art was seen as decorative, it was seen as provincial, it was seen as derivative. But what happens in the 1990s is that the auction houses enter the scene. And that's when you see the repositioning of art. Because if you had to establish an economic value for art and make it saleable, you first had to establish the cultural, its cultural value. And then begins that whole process of, I won't say educating, I would say providing information to the West. And so auction houses, researchers, scholars all start building this whole story and laying the cultural context, building the backgrounds of the artists, laying out how the artists actually were looking for a new idiom that was uniquely Indian, but was also responding to movements in the global scenario. And I think music also in the West realized that aberration. And they started re-looking at their collecting practices, what were the kind of narratives they were telling, and also the kind of language that they used to talk about the cultures of another country. And now if you look at it, for example, Tate has a South Asian Acquisitions Committee. And there are members from all over the world. It has a substantial amount of money. There are members from Asia that are all part of it. They've had a retrospective on Bhupen Kakkar. The Guggenheim has had a retrospective on Gaitonde. The Asia Society Museum does a spotlight on progressives. And Souza himself is in the collection of the Tate, the British Museum, the Glenborough Art Museum, the V&A. So I think, and for me, I remember last month I walked into a museum in Düsseldorf, and there I came upon the work of a young artist, Arpita Akanda of Morissa. So I think people are realizing that they need to be a little more inclusive. They need to have a world context, not a Western art context, and that's how things are changing.
After all, we're the world's most populous nation with almost 1.5 billion, so it's about time artists get recognition. Janeita, I'm just coming back to you on Souza's treatment of religious themes, especially the works of Golgotha in Goa and Crucifixion, which reveals a striking satire and critique of power structures. So how do you think how do you interpret Souza's recurring focus on religion and power, and what was he ultimately trying to convey about these two institutions through his art?
So there's an irreconcilable rupture that the nail body of Jesus on a cross, and which troubled Souza since his childhood, and he tried to express that in his art endlessly. So he would draw, he would draw upon realism, right, and kind of amalgamate it with expressionism and strands of surrealism, as also cubism, in his religious imagery. And it was heavy with metaphor about the cruelty and apathy of man to man. Because at the core, the essence is that the noblest, the truest, and was put to death. Right? And so he kind of pulled the rug, cut through the lines of power and authority, as also hypocrisy and bigotry in organized religion, and showcased that. Right? So if we, and they say that the journey of the self begins in conflict. So there are lots of paradoxes that Souza grew up with, about good and evil, about East and West, masculine and feminine, and what he saw in the church, and what he saw the Devdasis dancing in the temple satras in Goa. So there were all these conflicts that he grew up with, and so I think his individuation journey began when he entered his teens. So that when he's 16 years old, he puts out these emancipated figures, heads, as also paintings to do with religion. Right? So he's making a very bold statement. And Golgotha in Goa is a very powerful satire, where he juxtaposes the tableau of Golgotha, the cruelty and pathos of Golgotha, against the backdrop of a Baroque church in Goa, with all the splendor and ceremony around it. So it's a celebration of gluttonous wealth that he is indicting and pointing his arrow at. So yeah, even Death of Pope is a very interesting, very powerful work. And we are all familiar with the Crucifixion 1959, which is on public display at the Tate.
Wonderful. I wonder what he would paint in these days. But anyway, Kamini, I was just reading a few days back, the Mumbai High Court ordered the Customs Department to release 7 paintings. 4 of them were from Souza's that had been confiscated on the grounds of being obscene. Souza, as you know, obviously was controversial, famous for his nudes, including his self-nudes. So despite more than 2 decades of Souza's passing, they continue to provoke reactions, including having legal interventions. What do you think instances like this reveal about the constant and the continued struggle of censorship of art and the artist's gaze, and even in today's time?
You know, it never ceases to amaze me how we, a country who celebrates the human form in all its glory, who has produced scholarly texts on sexual pleasure, should suddenly turn so prudish. Because, I mean, yes, we are inflicted with Victorian morality, but that, I mean, we are 77 years into independence. And for Souza, it's ironic, because in 1949, when he did his first exhibition, he had a nude self-portrait. And of course, the police marched in and thought, this will not do for a decent society. And they actually tried to cover the genitalia. And then they felt, this is not working either. So they seized the paintings and raided his house for pornographic material. And very much the same happened to Akbar. Akbar Padamsi, he had this, in his exhibition at the Jahangir Art Gallery, he had the painting called Lovers, where the man has his hand on the woman's breast. And of course, he was marched off to the police station and then to court to explain himself. But if you look at it, artists really have been anti-establishment, and art is an incredible tool to try and interrogate systems, values. Artists have always been at the forefront of protests and of movements. And so governments have a healthy respect for them at best and are mostly wary of them. But if you look at it, it is not only governments that bring about censorship today. It is various, or through the ages, it has been society as well that brings in various forms of censorship. Because if you look at it, Vijay Tendulkar's play, Ghasiyon Kotpal, offended a certain section of Brahmins. The satanic verses, annoyed a certain section of the Muslims. One of our most iconic artists had to flee the country because it offended right-wing Hindus. So
the ban on the satanic verses has now been lifted because they couldn't find the paperwork. So it's all good, and now we have Instagram, so everything's possible. Janeita, you mentioned the Head series as a remarkable exploration of human consciousness, capturing the interplay between animal instinct and higher thought. How does Souza's work on the series express his attempt to transcend primal instincts, and what insight does it provide into the human psyche?
So I would say, yeah.
If you look at Souza's early art, what drew me in is the heads, and that too women heads, that he began with very intelligent, pensive, contemplative women. And in my research, then I went into, of course, the Zatras, where the Devdasis, the Kalavans, known as the Kalavans in Goa, would dance to the legends of Durga and Kali, which he grew up watching. As also, there were these warrior queens from Karnataka, like Abaka Mahadevi, Kittur Chinnamma, who defended their kingdoms from the invasion by the British and the Portuguese also. So, and they had entered the Yakshagana plays, the traveling theatre, which would go to different parts of the Konkan coast. So he watched these growing up, right? So he came out with these women heads when he was still he had not even entered JJ at that time. Okay? And they are very, very remarkable and striking. Another thing I would say is that, his anima, the feminine within him, the wisdom, right, was guiding him and had become vociferous and vital when he entered, with 12, 13 years, so that at 16 he comes out with a radical body of work. Yeah. Also, a second psychic journey came about in the 1960s. Yeah. Is when, there's this electoral jingoism, the Cold War, talks about nuclear waste and the atomic bomb and so on. So then it became imperative that, we no longer ignore man's psyche. Because more than the nuclear war, it was the man's psyche which had become a dreaded threat to human existence. So the body of work from 60s onwards, when he also came across Sanford Redmond's theory, the American scientist, which changed his viewpoint completely, and he called nature as the sole principle. And so from the 80s, the last part is where in my research, I say the ripening of the rebel. Because the nudes and the heads that he came up at that time are really remarkable. And there are many there as images in this book. So I would say that if you study his heads from the point of view of Jean Gebser, who talks about consciousness and mutation, how we develop from one to the other, as also Carl Jung and the French philosopher Chardin, Teilhard Chardin, The Phenomenon of Man. His head series is as interesting as his female nude, because that ran parallel to the female nude, and both of them, he was as prolific, both sides.
Thank you for that. Kamini, we mentioned earlier Souza was the founding member of the Progressive Artist Group, the single most important artist movement in the country. Souza brought MFSN into the group, and then, infamously he was expelled from JJ School of Art. So what is the significance of artists like Souza with radical imagination in shaping traditional art education, and what are some lessons for contemporary arts institutions?
It's really difficult to talk about art education in India because it leaves much to be desired. And let me give you an example of my experience. When I first joined the JNF and I was working on my first exhibition, I turned the focus on women. And why? Because I discovered that the JJ School, which is a premier institution in the country, its formal curriculum for graduate studies was exploring, it did an analysis of the seminal work of artists from all across the country. But all of them were male. There was only a token Amrita Shergill, which was part of their studies, and I'm sure that has changed. But what was the kind of curriculum that we were preparing for our students that was so skewed? We have, of course, had great institutions, MSU Baroda, Shantiniketan, and wherever the educationists have been dynamic leaders, great educationists. You've seen they've become creative hot shops. For example, you've seen K.G. Subramaniam, N.S. Bendre, who founded the whole Baroda school movement, and that gave birth to artists like Ghulam Sheikh and Bhupen Thakkar. And in Shantiniketan, again, you had Nandalal Bose, you had Vinod Bihari Mukherjee. And many of those students were the ones who actually went forward to start the Bengal movement. The same in the South, KCS Panikar, and he started their version of the progressive movement from the Government Arts and Craft College. But what about today? I mean, when we look across the country, what is it that, are we exposing our students to practices that are happening across the world, new trends and movements? You have schools like, say, Shrishti, which are providing in Bangalore, which has a stimulating environment for art students, but how many of them are there in the country? What about the digital space? There's so much happening with technology and with artificial intelligence. But where does someone go to learn about this? Where do they acquire these skills? And it's not only artists. If we're looking at the whole art ecosystem, there's art management, there's curators. Where do young curators go to study? Everyone cannot afford to go abroad. So there's really a huge amount of capacity building that we need to do for art education.
Just to add to that, especially as with AI, you mentioned, the future of work is obviously changing. And there's an article in the Times this week about these new jobs that have been created: synthetic media planner, human interface designer. I mean, there are these real terms which are coming, and it's all AI upskilling, but where are you going to skill? It's actually a very relevant question, and this is within the arts, not in general. Janeita, now we'll come to the important loaded question. Since we don't have too much time left, I know you want to talk about that. You describe your work as a feminist reading of Souza's art, pointing to his nuanced portrayals of female nudes. How does Souza's representation of the female form reflect a rejection of traditional submissive portrayals, and what does it reveal about the feminine principle he sought to reassert?
So they say when the going gets rough, the tough get going. So it's the second year into World War II, 1940, and Souza is this 16-year-old young artist, and he began putting out emancipated figures and heads on his canvas. Now these figures, primarily the female nude, is distinctive, original, as also perplexing, because women in everyday society raised on paternal values look demure and downcast, whereas these women, none of them was shrinking, sheepish, self-effacing, self-conscious, sheepish. They were just themselves, as if reclaiming their organic cosmic design. And they just stood matter of fact. And just by being themselves, they were making a bold statement. So I would say that I believe that Souza's figurative art, codes a social revolution, that of he visualized a society made up of liberated men and women, a strong man, a strong woman, coding a symbolism of Prakriti and Purusha, the Ardhanarishwaran, where the both of them are equal and they stand together. Yeah? And for that, he had to, from his unconscious, a denied feminine principle which came up in his dream visions, like he would say in his childhood. He was a solitary person, and he would talk to goblins and elves and all. So all this began that time. And so it's the denied feminine principle erupting from his unconscious, which is giving shape and form on his canvas. And you see, this feminist movement came to us in the 1970s, where feminist artists, began doing performing art using their own bodies to put out those vulgar, obscene, titillating, awe-inspiring, as also secretive female concepts, and making them normal and mainstream. A pictorial language that Souza had been portraying on his canvas since the 1940s. So decidedly we can say that Souza was a predecessor to the feminist movement which took New York by a storm in the 1970s.
Thank you.
No, just one sentence here I'd like to add, and the story parlays ahead. 1996, Eve Ensler comes out with Vagina Monologues, and Mahavana Kotwal and Dolly Thakur watch this play. There's a visceral connect, they were charged, and they have to buy those rights and bring it to India. 2003, Prithvi Theatre stages that play because they feel it's so relevant and it'll just bring our women into their own, right? And that play lives on. It's a living tradition 20 years down the line, and something that Souza was coding in his visual vocabulary, an emancipated vocabulary of agency and freedom, which we are only arriving at now.
But ironically, we launched Eve Ensler's second book at the Opera House a couple of years back. Kami, I know you want to respond to this.
No, I agree with you, Janeita, that Souza's women are very strong. They do not conform to conventions of shame, modesty. They confront you. And Souza's art was a contrast to the dilution of the goddess image. Because if you look at the Devi Mahatmya text, the women are, the Devi is a strong, fierce, powerful goddess who vanquishes evil. But when you look at the goddess, images of the goddess in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you see this cherubic image of a goddess who is benign and patient and resilient and nurturing, all the qualities that society felt a woman should have, and these became the models for women. And so Souza's women do not conform to them. But my problem with them is that they're unidimensional. You see them through a certain lens, through the sexual lens. They have agency, but sexual agency. And the image also conforms to the early goddess image. Where they, you see them, like you see their sexuality, fertility, procreation. But either women were portrayed as goddesses or as objects of desire. But where is the space for them to be just mortals with the normal ambitions, desires, frailties of life that everyone else is entitled to? And that, I think, is missing.
Want to respond to that, or can we move on?
No, but you have to look at some images in the book also. Some more images where there's this woman caught up in an agonizing moment, or another just standing and laughing, and yeah.
All right, just before I open it up to audience, for any questions in the audience? Do you have mics? Or should I go on? Come on, Dodo, ask one.
Let you see the book first. Looks beautiful, thank you.
Yeah, there's a question at the back. Oh, no, and the front. Two questions.
Should I just ask? Is this?
Are you taking the mic to them?
I think we can hear them.
Yes, one. Please share. Come.
Ladies first.
Hi. So I think my question was regarding the question of patronage. So like whenever we talk about art, patronage becomes a very important factor. So especially if we see in India's modernist art movement, it was intricately linked to histories of atomic research and funding from the government, which is related to histories of violence. So I guess my question was that in Souza's artwork, do we see this negotiation that is sort of happening with people who are responsible for patronage and how the state structure is happening, and while working within the same system. So what's happening there? That was my question.
You?
You know what? It was a great struggle, I think, for artists in the early days, because I remember talking to Dadiba Pandol from Pandol, which was one of the two galleries that were here. So that was the only support. The gallerists actually worked hard to try and get people in to build the career of the artist. It was a lonely journey. And for Souza particularly, it was far lonelier, because he had the kind of art, he was in conflict with society, with the establishment, with religion. And he unfortunately burst onto the scene when India had just gained independence. So we had gone through a huge period of strife. So people were looking for peace, for stability, for building a unifying identity, and this was a disruptor. His images really were disruptive, and people were simply not ready for that. So he struggled, I think, throughout his life. He was quite wounded by the fact that India didn't really accept his art. Money was always a struggle. I remember Golgotha in Goa that you're talking about. In 1999, he had to sell it, and he had made it in 1948. So he had hung on to this work right through his life, and then had to part with it. And when he speaks to the gallerist Uday Jain in Dumimal, and he had this famous show in 1976, and then the Prime Minister had come. And he asked him, what soul? And he said, one painting soul. And Souza is stunned. So that's really how we struggled.
We also had Art Mumbai going on right now, and Dumimal has some wonderful paintings of Souza, and also the Saffron Art Foundation is doing a wonderful show which Girishane has curated of Souza and Guy Garonte. So it's kind of apt for today. So, your question?
Dumimal has a wonderful collection of heads. Remarkable, as the female nude, yeah. There are lots in that book.
So I think on the cover of the book, you have that Saffron Art. It's in the Saffron Art Museum. Right?
The cover of the book is from Jane and Quito Deborn collection, and that is a part of Souza Kalam, which is in collaboration with miniature artists.
Yeah, which is, I think, in the Saffron Art thing.
It is there. Yeah.
You can see it there.
But if you see the
Yeah, no, fair enough. But I'm just saying it's there for people to see.
Yeah, it's from their collection, and
it's available to see. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
it's available to see.
Okay, the second question I have is actually, is this complete? Okay, I'll come to the conclusion later. So most of the images that are in the book seem to be of one collector or something like that.
They are from Dumimal collection, the Christie's, Saffron Art, also Sotheby's, and Jane and Quito. So there's
Jane and Quito are the daughters, right?
Jane and Kito are
Collectors.
the collectors.
Okay,
They're a
okay.
husband and wife.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Dutch couple.
Dutch couple,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay.
But they have a huge Indian collection with
Okay,
them.
fair enough,
Yeah,
fair
so
enough.
the covers from
Yeah, but
there.
you know, the lot of images we see are mostly in the 80s and 90s, 80s. The really strong works are very few in the book, so, it's,
But I
just,
would context that there
no,
are
just
very
ask-
strong works, yeah.
okay, there's some, I'm not saying all.
All right.
Yeah.
That's another whole panel discussion.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Okay,
That generate, yeah, a
Okay.
whole dialogue around
okay,
that.
thank
yeah.
you. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions? Mike, please.
Hi. Talking about Souza, we usually refer to his radical art, his radical imagination as far as artistic landscape is concerned, but very often we get to hear about his writing expertise because he was a writer, a prolific writer as well. I mean, probably the most famous essay would be Nirvana of a Maggot. So any thoughts, any comments on Souza's writing, per se, and how did it influence the artwork or vice versa?
Actually, there's a quote by Souza, which is part of Nirvana of a Maggot. And in that, he speaks about, like, he says that I'm not so sure about my grammar and my syntax. He was a good writer, but in his hearts of hearts, he always thought, I'm a better painter, I'm a better artist than a writer. And so he was always inclined to do that more, and we have an exhaustive body of work over there. So his autobiographical writing, it's just words and lines, it's just 27 pages, which also includes its sketches. And Nirvana of a Maggot is just an essay, which was published in the Encounter magazine in 1955. So he was a compulsive artist, and he's a cerebral artist. So his whole intellectual thought was just driven by his art. It had no space for anything else. If he had not been an artist, then maybe he would have made a wonderful writer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Great. So I'm going to continue. I have a few minutes more. So, Souza's work continues to captivate and confront viewers with its layers of exploration, identity, faith, human condition. As we look to the future, and we've already said this, lack of proper arts education in this country, how do you think Souza's radical imagination and complex themes will influence emerging artists and arts institutions?
So let me begin with myself. That, I had this connect with his art in my self-healing journey, and I began a research project. So the essays just kind of, I'm coming to that. And why I began with myself, because my belief is critique as an artist. And I'm living in contemporary times, so I'm bringing the dialogue to myself very cleverly.
Like Souza.
Yeah, and so inspired by his art is my writing, and which went into many extensions. Besides that is I feel that the book or Souza's body of work is about making of a consciousness. So all the contemporary artists, in which we include writers as well as sculptors, who are working towards the making of consciousness, are inspired. So the foreword is written by Devashish Banerjee, the eminent art historian and cultural theorist. So his latest book on quantum consciousness, and then I would go on to writings by contemporary writers about wild women, who's equal, as also ecological. And coming to artists, right? So there are artists in Goa who are greatly inspired by his Head series. I see it in their art. But an artist working towards the strengthening of the feminine principle, like Souza did, I've yet to come across.
We were, for our Festa de Goa, I was looking for Goan artists to do a kind of pop-up at the Opera House lobby. And we through working with a dealer there, we got so much work from all these young kids that looked like Souza's work. I mean, I said, I cannot put this in there, And even walking around the Art Mumbai, there are a couple of artist that I had to do a double take to look. Kamini, I'm just going to end with the last question with you, as we celebrate his legacy, and his works obviously have gained in value, in the market value and visibility immensely. But how can we ensure his legacy remains meaningful more than, the market value?
You know what, I think Souza was a man who marched to the beat of his own drum. He was just not cowed down by the indifference or the reactions to his work. I think he stayed true to the artistic voice in his head, and he really searched for a unique language. And his language was a language that he forged for himself, and I believe that really opened up the paths for artists who followed. So I think that's a whole legacy. He was also the architect of the Progressive Manifesto. He was the most articulate of the group. He was able to write well, and the Progressives are, well, arguably the cornerstone of the modern art movement in India. And see, he drew on traditional forms, and yet he opened himself up to what was happening in the rest of the world. And that's why when John Berger says, what you quoted, he straddles several cultures, but he serves none.
Yeah.
But the thing is, nobody wants to be a struggling artist in an attic all his life. And I think he really was upset by the fact that his work didn't sell. And look at him today. His is the highest value that for an Indian artist that has been sold. So his painting Birth was sold for 28 crores, and just very recently Lovers was sold for 40. So wherever he is, I hope he's looking down and smiling.
Or his family is. But anyway, congratulations once again, Janeita, for this book. I assume you're going to be signing books, and they are for sale. You did find the book, sir? Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Kamini. Hope to see more of you in Mumbai. Mumbai misses you. Thank you to the Lit Light team for inviting me to collaborate and the opportunity to decode the madness, the magic, and the magnificence of the legacy of Francis Newton Souza. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.